The coffee cup shattered against the linoleum floor at exactly 2:47 a.m., sending ceramic shards skittering beneath the chrome stools of Mickey's all-night diner. Sarah, Chen didn't flinch at the sound after 3 years of working the graveyard shift in this forgotten corner of Barstow, California. She'd grown immune to the symphony of breaking dishes, slamming doors, and raised voices that punctuated her nights. What made her pause, coffee pot suspended mid-pour, was the absolute stillness that followed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took U.S. long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Man who'd dropped the cup sat hunched at the counter, his massive frame trembling despite the desert heat that clung to the August air even at this ungodly hour. His uniform was immaculate pressed marine, dress blues that spoke of ceremony and honor, but his hands shook like autumn leaves in a windstorm. Sarah had served enough broken souls at this diner to recognize the signs. Another veteran fighting ghosts that only he could see. "Sorry about the mess," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. "I'll pay for it." Sarah set down the coffee pot and reached for the broom, her movements deliberate and unhurried. At 26, she'd learned that rushing toward someone's pain only made them retreat faster. "Don't worry about it, honey. Happens all the time." She swept the fragments into a neat pile, the soft scraping of bristles against floor the only sound in the diner. "You want me to get you a fresh cup?" When he looked up, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. His eyes held the kind of emptiness she'd only seen once before in her own reflection during those dark months after her father's funeral. But there was something else there. Something that made her forget about the cigarette burns scarring her forearms and the ache in her feet from 12-hour shifts. Purpose. Even drowning in whatever hell he was reliving, this man carried himself like someone who'd spent his life protecting others. "What's your name?" he asked, his gaze steady now, studying her with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading terrain and assessing threats. "Sarah." She poured fresh coffee into a new mug, noting how his eyes tracked every movement of her hands. "Sarah Chen." "Colonel Marcus Webb." He accepted the coffee with both hands, cradling it like a lifeline. United States Marine Corps. The diner's neon sign buzzed overhead, casting alternating shadows of red and blue across the colonel's weathered face. Sarah had always hated that sign. The way it flickered reminded her of a dying heartbeat, but tonight it seemed to frame something important, something that would change everything. "You're not from around here," Sarah observed, refilling the sugar dispensers with practiced efficiency. It wasn't a question. Barstow was a way station, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. The locals all carried the same resigned weariness, the knowledge that they'd been forgotten by a world that only remembered them when it needed to pass through. Colonel Webb's lips quirked upward in what might have been a smile. "Neither are you." She paused, sugar streaming from the industrial-sized bag into the glass container. He was right, of course. Her slight accent, barely perceptible after years of conscious effort, still colored certain words. "Taiwan," she said simply. "My family came here when I was 12. And you ended up in Barstow. Life has a funny way of putting you exactly where you need to be," Sarah replied, though she'd never believed those words until this moment. Something about this broken Marine made her want to believe in purpose again. The colonel set down his coffee mug with military precision, perfectly centered on the saucer. "What did you want to be before this?" The question hit her like cold water. No one ever asked what she wanted, not anymore. They saw the polyester uniform, the name tag crooked from too many washings, the calloused hands that spoke of manual labor, and they made their assumptions. Just another small-town waitress serving coffee to truckers and insomniacs, invisible as wallpaper. "A teacher," she heard herself say, "elementary school. I wanted to help kids learn that they could be anything." The admission felt dangerous, like exposing a wound that had never properly healed. Colonel Webb nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. My daughter wanted to be a teacher too. The past tense hung between them like a loaded weapon. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the medallion she wore beneath her uniform, a small pewter piece her grandmother had pressed into her palm the day before she died. It bore the image of Guanyan, the goddess of mercy, and though Sarah had long since stopped believing in divine intervention, she'd never stopped wearing it. What happened to her? The words slipped out before Sarah could stop them, too personal for a conversation between strangers. But Colonel Webb didn't seem like a stranger anymore. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a photograph, edges worn soft from handling. The image showed a young woman in graduation regalia, her smile bright enough to power the diner's failing neon sign. She had her father's eyes but her mother's gentle mouth, and she held a teaching certificate like a trophy. Lieutenant Amanda Webb, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. She taught second grade at a school near Camp Pendleton. Every morning, she'd get there an hour early to prepare lessons. Every evening, she'd stay late to help kids who were struggling. He traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb. 3 weeks ago, she was coming home from a parent-teacher conference when a drunk driver ran a red light. The words landed like physical blows. Sarah found herself gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white against the chrome. She'd served thousands of customers, heard countless sob stories, but this felt different, personal. I'm so sorry, she whispered, the inadequacy of the words burning her throat. Colonel Webb tucked the photograph back into his pocket with the same careful precision he'd used for the coffee mug. She left behind a classroom full of kids who adored her, a lesson plan for the entire school year, and a father who spent 30 years training Marines to be the best versions of themselves, only to realize he never learned how to be the best version of himself. The air conditioning unit kicked on with a mechanical wheeze, stirring the stale air and the scent of grease from the kitchen. Sarah moved around the counter without conscious thought, settling onto the stool beside Colonel Webb. She'd never sat with a customer before Mickey's unwritten rules were clear about maintaining professional distance, but rules seemed irrelevant in the face of such raw grief. She sounds like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, Sarah said softly. She was. The colonel's voice cracked slightly. And I was supposed to be the kind of father who knew how to help her change the world instead of just knowing how to end conflicts with a rifle scope. Sarah turned to study his profile, noting the precision of his haircut, the perfect posture that probably came from decades of military discipline. But beneath the surface polish, she saw something familiar, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd spent their life taking care of others while forgetting to take care of themselves. What kind of work do you do? Colonel Webb asked suddenly. Besides this, the question caught her off guard. This is what I do. No, he said with quiet certainty. This is where you work. What do you do? Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like a lock finally turning after years of rust. I notice things, she said slowly. People, the way they hold their shoulders when they're carrying too much weight. The way they order their food when they haven't eaten in days. The way they count their change when every dollar matters. She paused, surprised by her own honesty. I try to make sure everyone who walks through that door feels seen. Colonel Webb turned to face her fully, his expression intense. That's a rare gift. It's not a gift, Sarah protested. It's just paying attention. Same thing. The bell above. The diner's entrance chimed and a trucker shambled in, his clothes wrinkled from highway sleep. Sarah started to stand, but Colonel Webb placed a gentle hand on her arm. Let me get him, he said. You've been working all night. Before Sarah could protest, the colonel was behind the counter, moving with surprising familiarity as he poured coffee and took the trucker's order. She watched him work, noting how he met the man's eyes, how he listened when the trucker mentioned missing his daughter's birthday for the 3rd year running. Colonel Webb didn't just serve food, he served attention, dignity, the simple recognition that every person who walked through those doors mattered. When the trucker left 20 minutes later, he was standing straighter, and his tip was twice what Sarah usually received. "How did you know how to do that?" she asked as Colonel Webb returned to his seat. "Leadership isn't about commanding from a distance," he said, wiping his hands on a dish rag. "It's about understanding the people you're responsible for. Understanding what they need, what drives them, what breaks them." He met her eyes. "What fixes them?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sarah felt something awakening in her chest, something she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed. Hope, not the desperate, grasping kind that had sustained her through community college before her father's medical bills ate her savings, but something steadier, more dangerous. "Why are you really here, Colonel Webb?" she asked. He was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, careful. "I came here to die." The admission hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Sarah had suspected something dark was driving him, but hearing it spoken aloud made her stomach clench with unexpected fear. "The desert," he continued, gazing out the diner's windows toward the vast darkness beyond. "It's clean, honest. A man could walk out there and just disappear. No mess for anyone else to clean up. No complicated explanations." He turned back to her, his eyes holding a terrible clarity. "But then I met a waitress who sees people. Really sees them. And I started thinking that maybe disappearing isn't the answer." Sarah's throat felt tight, words jamming together like traffic. She'd never talked anyone out of suicide hell. There'd been nights when she'd understood the appeal all too well, but something about this moment demanded everything she had. "What would Amanda want you to do?" she asked quietly. Colonel Webb's composure finally cracked, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "She'd want me to keep teaching. To find another way to make the world better instead of just making it safer." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the gesture somehow making him seem more human, more reachable. "But I don't know how to do that. I know how to train Marines. I know how to hit targets from 1,000 yards. I know how to read terrain and weather patterns and enemy movements. But I don't know how to help second graders learn to read." Sarah reached across the space between them, covering his scarred hand with her own. "Maybe that's not what the world needs from you. Then what does it need?" The question hung in the air like incense, sacred and demanding. Sarah found herself thinking about all the broken people who'd passed through Mickey's doors. Veterans struggling with PTSD, single mothers working 3 jobs, kids aging out of foster care with nowhere to go. All of them invisible to a world that had bigger problems to solve. "Someone who sees them," she said finally. "Someone who knows what it means to serve. Someone who understands that leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about making sure everyone in the room knows they matter." Colonel Webb studied her face as if memorizing it. "And what does the world need from you, Sarah Chen?" The question struck her like lightning, illuminating corners of her heart she'd kept dark for years. She saw herself at 12, stepping off the plane at LAX with a backpack full of dreams and a head full of English phrases she'd practiced until her tongue bled. She saw herself at 18, starting community college with scholarships and plans to transfer to UCLA. She saw herself at 22, dropping out to care for her father as cancer ate away everything they'd built in America. "I don't know," she whispered, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. "Yes, you do." Colonel Webb's voice was gentle but implacable. "You've always known. That's why you're here, in this place at this time. That's why we found each other. Outside." The first pale fingers of dawn crept across the desert horizon, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility. Sarah watched the light grow stronger, thinking about all the nights she'd witnessed the same sunrise, alone and unseen. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a beginning. "Tell me about the rifle," she said suddenly, remembering the way. He'd studied her movements, the military precision of everything he did. Colonel Webb's expression shifted, becoming almost reverent. "My service rifle. A Macmillan TAC-50. I carried it through 3 deployments, trained hundreds of Marines to use similar weapons. It's more than just a tool, it's responsibility made manifest. The power to protect or destroy, depending on who wields it and why. Why are you telling me this?" He reached into another pocket, withdrawing a small brass key attached to a leather cord. "Because I think it's time it served a different purpose." Sarah stared at the brass key in Colonel Webb's palm, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. The leather cord was darker where his thumb had rubbed against it, and she could smell the faint scent of gun oil and desert dust clinging to the metal. Something about the weight of the moment made her acutely aware of everything: the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, the tick of the wall clock marking another minute past 3 a.m., the way Colonel Webb's breathing had steadied since he'd spoken his truth about coming here to die. "I don't understand," she said, though part of her did. Part of her had been understanding since the moment he'd looked at her with those haunted, purposeful eyes. "You will." He closed her fingers around the key, his hands warm and calloused from decades of service. "But first, tell me about your father." The request struck her like a physical blow. Sarah yanked her hand back as if the key had burned her, her chest tightening with familiar panic. She never talked about her father, not with Mickey, not with the handful of acquaintances she'd made in Barstow, not even with herself when the anniversary of his death rolled around each February. "How did you, the way you moved when I mentioned Amanda?" Colonel Webb's voice was gentle but relentless. "Recognition, loss, the kind of grief that changes how you carry yourself in the world." He leaned back slightly, giving her space but keeping his eyes fixed on her face. "You understand what it means to lose someone who defined your sense of purpose." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her throat, fingers finding the chain that held her grandmother's medallion. The pewter was warm against her palm, smoothed by years of worry and prayer. She'd been touching it the night her father died, standing in the hallway outside his hospital room, while machines beat their electronic symphony of failure. "He was everything," she said, the words barely audible above the diner's ambient noise. "When we came to America, he worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Days at a factory, evenings cleaning office buildings, weekends doing landscaping for rich families in Pasadena. He never complained, never acted like the sacrifice was too much." Her voice cracked. "He just kept saying that America was a place where hard work mattered, where his daughter could become anything she dreamed of being." Colonel Webb nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "And you believed him?" "God, yes." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I believed him so completely that I thought the hardest part would be choosing which university to attend, which career path to take. I had this whole life planned out, teaching credential, then a master's in education, maybe eventually running a school district. I was going to change the world one classroom at a time." "What happened?" The question was asked so quietly that Sarah might have missed it if she hadn't been watching his lips move. She closed her eyes, letting herself remember the phone call that had shattered everything. The doctor's voice, clinical and apologetic, explaining that the chest pain her father had been ignoring wasn't stress from overwork. It was his heart giving up under the weight of supporting a family in a country that demanded everything and promised nothing. "Stage 4 lung cancer," she said. "Never smoked a day in his life, but 20 years of factory work and cleaning chemicals had done their damage. The doctor said if we'd caught it 6 months earlier." She shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than words could express. "You dropped everything to take care of him. What choice did I have?" The question came out, sharper than Sarah intended, defensive in a way that surprised her. He'd given up everything for me. His career in Taiwan, he'd been an engineer, did you know that? Spoke 3 languages, had designed bridges that still carry traffic across Taipei. But his credentials didn't transfer, so he cleaned toilets and mowed lawns so his daughter could go to college. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The least I could do was be there when he needed me. Colonel Webb was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the same intensity he'd shown earlier. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who'd seen similar sacrifices played out in countless variations. How long did you take care of him? 2 years. The number felt both endless and insignificant. 2 years of chemotherapy and radiation, of watching him shrink into someone I barely recognized while the medical bills grew into something we could never hope to pay off. He kept apologizing, can you believe that? Apologizing for being sick, for costing money we didn't have, for ruining my plans. Sarah's voice broke completely, as if loving him was some kind of burden instead of the greatest privilege of my life. And when he died, I was 24 years old with $60,000 in medical debt, no degree, and no idea how to exist in a world where he wasn't there to tell me everything would work out. Sarah stared at her hands, noting the small scars from kitchen accidents, the permanent stain under her fingernails from years of coffee service. I took the first job I could find and started paying off what I owed him. What I owed the system that killed him. Colonel Webb leaned forward, his elbows on the counter. Sarah, look at me. She raised her eyes reluctantly, expecting to see pity or sympathy or any of the other useless emotions people offered when they learned her story. Instead, she found something harder to process: respect. Your father would be proud of you, he said with quiet conviction. Would he? The words came out as a broken whisper. I'm 26 years old, serving coffee in a diner that smells like grease and broken dreams. I live in a studio apartment above a laundromat, and my biggest accomplishment this week was convincing Mickey to replace the burned-out bulb in the women's restroom. This isn't what he sacrificed everything for, isn't it? Colonel Webb's voice carried a challenge. He sacrificed everything so you could be exactly who you are, someone who sees people, who offers dignity to strangers, who turns a roadside diner into a place where broken souls can find a moment of peace. He paused, letting his words sink in. You think your impact is small because you can't see the ripples. But I guarantee you that every person who sat at this counter has left different than they arrived, even if they couldn't name why. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like a door she'd kept locked for years finally creaking open. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Colonel Webb smiled, and for the first time since he'd entered the diner, the expression reached his eyes. 3 hours ago, I walked in here planning to finish a cup of coffee and then disappear into the desert. Now I'm sitting here thinking about ways to honor my daughter's memory instead of joining her. He reached across the counter and covered her hand with his. That's not accident, Sarah. That's purpose. The bell above the entrance chimed again, and Sarah looked up to see Margaret Flores shuffling through the door. Margaret was one of her regulars, a 73-year-old widow who suffered from insomnia and came in twice a week for decaf coffee and someone to talk to. Her arthritis made the walk from her apartment complex difficult, but she made the journey anyway, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. Morning, honey, Margaret called, settling onto her usual stool at the far end of the counter. You're looking bright-eyed for someone who's been working all night. Sarah started to stand, but Colonel Webb was already moving, coffee pot in hand. She watched him approach Margaret with the same careful attention he'd shown the trucker earlier, noting how he adjusted his posture to seem less intimidating, how he modulated his voice to match her energy level. Good morning, ma'am, he said, filling her mug with practiced ease. I'm Marcus. Sarah's told me so much about you. Sarah hadn't mentioned Margaret at all, but the lie was delivered with such sincerity that even she almost believed it. More importantly, Margaret's face lit up with the kind of joy that came from being recognized, remembered, valued. Has she now? Margaret's eyes sparkled with mischief as she glanced toward Sarah. All good things, I hope. She said you're the best part of her morning, Colonel Webb replied without missing a beat. That you always know exactly what to say to brighten her day. It was complete fiction, but as Sarah watched Margaret's posture straighten and her smile widen, she realized it was also completely true. Margaret did brighten her mornings in the small way that all human connection brightened the darkness. She just never thought to tell anyone. Colonel Webb returned to his seat as Margaret settled in with her coffee and the crossword puzzle she carried in her oversized purse. The exchange had taken less than 5 minutes, but Sarah felt as though she'd witnessed something profound, the deliberate creation of dignity. The conscious choice to make someone feel seen and valued. How did you know what to say to her? Sarah asked. Same way you know what to say to everyone who walks through that door, Colonel Webb replied. I paid attention. Margaret comes in alone, late at night, carrying a crossword puzzle she's probably already finished. She doesn't need coffee, she needs connection, recognition, someone to remind her that she's still matters in a world that's decided she's invisible. Sarah stared at him, pieces of understanding clicking into place like a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for years. You see it too. See what? The weight they're all carrying. The way they hold themselves when they think no one's looking. The stories written in their posture and their order choices and the way they count their change. She paused, overwhelmed by the recognition. I thought I was the only one. Colonel Webb's expression grew serious. There are others. Not many. But they exist. People who've learned to read between the lines, to see the need hiding behind the surface presentation. He leaned forward. The question is, what do you do with that ability? Before Sarah could answer, the entrance bell chimed again, and 3 teenagers stumbled in, their clothes wrinkled and their eyes red with exhaustion or substances or both. They looked like trouble, the kind of kids who'd order the cheapest items on the menu and leave a mess in their wake. Sarah felt her professional smile snap into place, the defensive politeness she used to manage difficult customers. But Colonel Webb was already standing, moving toward them with the same purposeful stride he'd used with Margaret. Sarah watched him approach the teenagers, noting how he kept his hands visible and his posture relaxed. How he met their defensive gazes without challenge or judgment. Long night? He asked, his voice carrying just enough authority to command respect without seeming threatening. The oldest of the 3, maybe 17, with anger radiating from his skinny frame like heat, looked up suspiciously. Yeah, so? You look like you could use some food and a safe place to sit for a while, Colonel Webb replied calmly. My treat. The offer hung in the air like a foreign concept. Sarah held her breath, watching the teenagers exchange glances, clearly debating whether this was genuine kindness or some kind of trap. She'd seen dozens of kids like this over the years, runaways, throwaways, kids aging out of systems that had never really cared about them in the first place. They usually ordered black coffee and stale donuts, ate quickly, and disappeared back into whatever darkness had brought them to Mickey's in the first place. Why? The girl in the group spoke up, her voice carrying suspicion earned through hard experience. What do you want? Nothing, Colonel Webb said simply. Just to make sure you eat something before you face whatever comes next. The teenagers looked at each other again, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, the angry boy shrugged. Whatever, man. We'll take some food. As Colonel Webb took their orders and Sarah moved to help prepare the food, she found herself thinking about what he'd said earlier, about seeing the ripples, about impact that couldn't be measured in conventional terms. These kids would probably forget this meal within a week, might even mock the strange man who'd bought them breakfast. But they'd also remember, somewhere deep in their cellular memory, that a stranger had looked at them and seen worth instead of trouble. You do this a lot? She asked quietly as they worked side by side in the narrow kitchen space. "Not enough," Colonel Webb replied, flipping eggs with surprising skill. "But I'm learning that opportunities present themselves when you're paying attention." Sarah watched him work, noting how he moved with the same precision he brought to everything else, but somehow made it look effortless. She'd been cooking in this kitchen for 3 years, and he was already more comfortable in the space than she'd ever felt. "Where did you learn to cook?" 23 years in the Marines, he said with a slight smile. "You learn to adapt to whatever situation you find yourself in." Field kitchens, mess halls, emergency rations heated over sterno cans in the middle of nowhere. He paused, spatula suspended over the grill. "But mostly, I learned by watching my wife. She could make a feast out of whatever was left in the refrigerator, and she always made sure there was enough for whoever showed up at our door." The past tense hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Your wife died 6 years ago. Cancer, like your father." Colonel Webb's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the effort it took to maintain that composure. "Amanda was only 16 when we lost her mother. I'd like to think I did okay raising her alone, but honestly, she was the one who held our family together." The teenagers' food was ready, and they carried the plates out together, Sarah watching as Colonel Webb delivered the meals with the same attention to dignity he'd shown Margaret. The kids ate hungrily, their defensive postures gradually relaxing as they realized no judgment or consequences were coming. When they left an hour later, the angry boy actually said thank you, and the girl squeezed Colonel Webb's hand before disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. "That was beautiful," Sarah said, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. "That was practice," Colonel Webb replied. "For something bigger." Sarah felt the brass key in her pocket, warm against her palm where she'd been unconsciously gripping. The rifle. He nodded, his expression growing serious. "But first, there's something else you need to understand about yourself." Colonel Webb reached into his jacket again, this time withdrawing a small notebook, its cover worn smooth by handling. He opened it to a page covered with precise handwriting observations, she realized. Notes about people. "I've been coming to places like this for months," he said quietly. "Diners, truck stops, bus stations. Places where people pass through, where they think they're invisible. I've been trying to understand something that my daughter knew instinctively, how to see the need hiding in plain sight." He turned the notebook toward her, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The page contained detailed observations about her, the way she moved through her routines, how she interacted with different types of customers, the small kindnesses she offered without conscious thought. "You've been watching me?" "Learning from you," he corrected gently. "You do something that most people can't or won't do. You see each person who walks through that door as an individual with their own story, their own struggles, their own dignity. You don't just serve food, Sarah. You serve hope." Sarah felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her want to retreat behind the professional politeness that had protected her for years. "It's just being decent to people." "No," Colonel Webb said with quiet intensity. "It's recognition that every life has value, even when that life looks nothing like your own. It's the conscious choice to offer dignity instead of judgment. It's leadership in its purest form, not commanding others, but elevating them." The words landed like seeds in fertile ground, taking root in places Sarah hadn't even known existed. She thought about all the customers she'd served over the years, the small moments of connection that had felt insignificant at the time. Single mother who'd broken down crying over a cold cup of coffee, overwhelmed by bills she couldn't pay and children she couldn't fail. The elderly man who came in every Sunday after visiting his wife's grave, needing someone to see that he still existed. The construction worker who'd been laid off and was too proud to ask for help, but grateful when Sarah accidentally brought him an extra sandwich. "They're not customers," she said suddenly. the realization hitting her like lightning. They're people who've lost their way. And somehow, I helped them remember which direction they were headed. Colonel Webb's smile was radiant. Now you're beginning to understand. The revelation should have felt like triumph, but as Sarah stood in the pre-dawn quiet of Mickey's diner, she felt something closer to vertigo. Understanding her gift was one thing, knowing what to do with it was entirely different. Colonel Webb seemed to sense her internal struggle, his expression patient but expectant, like a teacher waiting for a student to grasp a crucial concept. "There's something you need to see," he said finally, reaching into his jacket pocket once more. This time he withdrew a thick manila envelope, worn at the edges and sealed with military precision. "These are the reasons I came to Barstow." Sarah accepted the envelope with trembling fingers, noting the weight of whatever lay inside. The paper felt official, important in a way that made her stomach clench with anticipation. "What is it?" "Documentation," Colonel Webb said simply. "Evidence of a problem that's bigger than one diner, one town, one broken veteran sitting at your counter." He gestured toward the envelope. "Open it." Sarah broke the seal carefully, as if the contents might explode if handled roughly. Inside, she found photographs, official reports, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be personal testimonies written in various hands. The first photograph made her stomach lurch. A group of homeless veterans huddled around a barrel fire behind what looked like a fast food restaurant, their faces gaunt with hunger and hopelessness. "This was taken in San Bernardino last month," Colonel Webb explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. 14 veterans, all discharged within the past 5 years, all struggling with PTSD, addiction, or physical disabilities that make traditional employment impossible. He pointed to a figure in the background, barely visible in the shadows. "That's Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Bronze Star recipient. He's been living in his car for 8 months because the VA housing program has a 2-year waiting list." Sarah lifted the photograph with shaking hands, studying the faces of men and women who'd served their country only to be abandoned by it. Their eyes held the same haunted quality she'd seen in Colonel Webb's gaze when he first entered the diner, but without the underlying strength that still anchored him to purpose. "How many?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "In this region?" "Conservative estimate puts it around 300. Colonel Webb's jaw tightened. "Nationally, we're looking at close to 40,000 homeless veterans at any given time. That's not counting the ones living in substandard conditions, the ones crashing on couches or sleeping in their cars, the ones who've given up hope entirely." Sarah flipped through more photographs, each one a testament to systemic failure. Veterans standing in soup kitchen lines, veterans sleeping under highway overpasses, veterans with missing limbs holding cardboard signs at traffic lights, reduced to begging from the same society they'd sworn to protect. "This is criminal," she whispered, her voice thick with rage she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. "It gets worse." Colonel Webb reached across the counter and turned to a section of official documents. "These are reports I compiled during my final months of active duty. Evidence of gaps in the system, bureaucratic roadblocks that prevent veterans from accessing services they've earned." His finger traced a line of statistics that made Sarah's vision blur with fury. Average wait time for mental health services, 6 months. Average processing time for disability claims, nearly 2 years. Average response time for housing assistance, indefinite. The documents painted a picture of deliberate neglect, a system designed more to discourage claims than to provide support. Sarah found herself thinking about Colonel Webb's daughter, about all the children these veterans would never get to teach or protect or inspire because they'd been abandoned by the country they'd served. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "Because you have the gift," Colonel Webb said simply. "You see people, really see them. And more importantly, you know how to help them remember their worth." He gestured toward the envelope. These men and women don't need more bureaucracy or empty promises. They need someone who can look at them and see the heroes they still are, even when they can't see it themselves. Sarah set the documents aside, her hands trembling with a combination of anger and something that felt dangerously like purpose. What exactly are you asking me to do? Before Colonel Webb could answer, the diner's entrance bell chimed with unusual violence, the doors slamming against the wall with enough force to rattle the windows. Sarah looked up to see a man inexpensive suit striding through the doorway, his expression radiating the kind of authority that came from never being told no. Behind him followed two other men, one carrying a briefcase, the other holding what appeared to be an official document. "Ms. Chen?" The lead man's voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to intimidating people into compliance. "I'm Richard Blackwood, representing the Barstow City Planning Commission. I need to speak with you about this establishment." Sarah felt Colonel Webb tense beside her, his posture shifting into something more alert, more dangerous. She'd never seen him look threatening before, but something about his stillness now reminded her that he was, fundamentally, a weapon trained by the United States military. "The diner doesn't open officially for another 3 hours," Sarah said, moving around the counter to face the newcomers. "If you need to speak with someone about planning issues, you'll have to come back when Mickey's here." Blackwood's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Actually, Ms. Chen, you're exactly who I need to speak with. You see, we've received reports about irregularities in your employment status, concerns about the demographic you've been serving here." The words hit Sarah like a slap. She'd been careful, so careful, to avoid drawing attention to herself or the diner. Her work visa had expired 2 years ago, but Mickey paid her in cash and never asked questions, and she'd convinced herself that as long as she kept her head down and caused no trouble, she could continue building the life her father had died, believing she deserved. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice carried the tremor of someone whose worst fears were being confirmed. "Don't you?" Blackwood opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with photographs and documents. "We have surveillance footage of you serving alcohol to minors, documentation of health code violations, and eyewitness testimony about the unsavory characters you've been allowing to loiter in this establishment." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized some of the photographs the teenagers Colonel Webb had fed, captured in grainy surveillance images that made their exhaustion look like intoxication, their hunger look like criminal intent. Margaret's late-night visits, documented with timestamps that suggested something inappropriate instead of the simple human need for connection. "Those photos are taken completely out of context," Sarah protested, but she could already see how the narrative would unfold. In the hands of someone determined to paint her as a threat, every act of kindness could be twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. "Context is a matter of interpretation," Blackwood replied smoothly. "What matters is that we have a responsibility to ensure that businesses in Barstow operate within the bounds of law and community standards." He gestured toward Colonel Webb, who had remained ominously silent throughout the exchange. Case in point, allowing clearly disturbed individuals to harass other customers and create an atmosphere of danger. Colonel Webb stood slowly, his movement fluid and controlled in a way that made the briefcase-carrying man take an involuntary step backward. "I'd be very careful about your next words," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had commanded Marines in combat zones. Blackwood's confident mask slipped slightly, but he rallied quickly. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm advising you," Colonel Webb replied with deadly calm. "You've walked into a place of business at 4 a.m, disrupted the peace, and made accusations against a young woman whose only crime is treating people with dignity. That suggests either incompetence or malice, and either way, you're about to find yourself in a situation you're not equipped to handle." The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut, But Sarah felt something else building beneath her fear-anger. These men had invaded her sanctuary, threatened the small piece of purpose she'd managed to carve out of her broken life. And worst of all, they were using her compassion as evidence against her. "You want to know about context?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Those teenagers you photographed, they were hungry, alone, and scared. The alcohol you claim I served them was coffee with extra sugar, because they looked like they hadn't eaten in days. That disturbed individual you're so concerned about is a decorated Marine colonel who spent the night helping me serve people that the rest of society has written off as disposable." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Ms. Chen, I strongly advise you to cooperate with this investigation. Your immigration status makes you particularly vulnerable to. Are you threatening to have me deported for being kind to people?" Sarah's voice cracked like a whip, surprising even herself with its intensity. "For treating human beings like they matter instead of like problems to be solved." "I'm explaining reality," Blackwood replied coldly. "This diner has become a magnet for undesirable elements. Homeless individuals, drug users, illegal immigrants. Stop." Colonel Webb's voice cut through Blackwood's words like a blade. "You need to leave, now. We're conducting official city business. You're conducting a harassment campaign against a woman whose only crime is possessing more humanity than you'll ever understand." Colonel Webb moved closer, not threatening but implacable. "And you're doing it badly enough that a first-year law student could tear your case apart in 5 minutes. Sarah watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't random bureaucratic harassment. This was targeted, personal, designed to shut down something that someone found threatening. But what could possibly be threatening about a diner that served coffee to insomniacs and breakfast to broken souls? "Who sent you?" she asked suddenly, the question dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. Blackwood's carefully composed expression flickered for just a moment, long enough for Sarah to catch a glimpse of something that looked like guilt. "This is a routine compliance investigation. Bullshit." The profanity felt foreign on Sarah's tongue, but satisfying in a way that surprised her. Routine investigations don't happen at 4 a.m. with intimidation tactics and surveillance photos. Someone wants this place shut down, and they want me gone. The question is why. Colonel Webb had been studying the men with the focused intensity he'd shown earlier when reading her customer interactions. Now his expression shifted into something harder, more dangerous. "Gentlemen," he said with deceptive calm, "I think it's time you understood exactly who you're dealing with." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a military ID card, holding it where they could see the official seals and classifications. Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Marine Corps, 23 years of active duty, including 3 combat deployments, and command of training operations at Camp Pendleton. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The man with the briefcase actually took a step backward, and even Blackwood's aggressive posture faltered slightly. "More relevantly," Colonel Webb continued, "I'm someone with extensive experience in recognizing enemy action, identifying threats to operational security, and neutralizing attempts at intimidation." His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Right now, I'm seeing a coordinated effort to disrupt a civilian operation that poses no threat to public safety or community welfare. That makes me very curious about who's giving the orders and why." Sarah felt something shift in the atmosphere of the diner, power dynamics realigning as Colonel Webb's presence transformed from protective to commanding. She'd seen him be gentle with broken customers, patient with her questions, vulnerable in sharing his grief. Now she was seeing the warrior, the leader who'd trained others to face impossible odds and emerge victorious. "This is highly irregular," Blackwood protested, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "What's irregular," Colonel Webb replied, "is using city resources to harass a business owner who's committed no crimes while ignoring actual problems that require attention." He gestured toward the envelope of documents still spread across the counter. For instance, the growing population of homeless veterans in this region, who could benefit from exactly the kind of support and dignity that Ms. Chen provides here. Sarah watched Blackwood's eyes dart toward the photographs of homeless veterans, noting how his expression shifted from aggressive to uncomfortable. Those issues are being addressed through proper channels. What proper channels? Sarah interrupted, her anger finally finding its voice. The same channels that take 2 years to process disability claims? The same proper channels that leave decorated veterans sleeping under bridges while bureaucrats attend meetings about addressing the problem? She moved to the counter and began spreading out the photographs Colonel Webb had shown her, each image a testament to systemic failure. You want to talk about undesirable elements? How about a society that sends young people to fight wars and then abandons them when they come home broken? How about a system that criminalizes poverty while ignoring the conditions that create it? The official documents seemed to multiply as Sarah arranged them, creating a mosaic of institutional neglect that filled the counter space. Blackwood's confident demeanor cracked further as he recognized some of the official letterhead, the government seals that authenticated each piece of evidence. Where did you get these? He asked, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. From someone who spent his career serving a country that taught him the difference between right and wrong, Sarah replied, glancing at Colonel Webb with newfound respect. Someone who understands that real security comes from taking care of the people who've sacrificed everything to protect others. Colonel Webb stepped forward, his presence filling the space between them and the officials in a way that made further intimidation impossible. Gentlemen, I think we've established that this establishment operates well within legal bounds and serves a vital community function. Unless you have actual evidence of criminal activity, which we both know you don't, I suggest you redirect your efforts toward problems that actually exist. Blackwood looked between Sarah and Colonel Webb, clearly calculating whether continued confrontation was worth the risk. Whatever he saw in their faces apparently convinced him that retreat was the better option. This isn't over, he said, attempting to reclaim some semblance of authority. We'll be monitoring this situation closely. Please do, Sarah replied, with surprising calm. And while you're monitoring, pay attention to what actual community service looks like. You might learn something. The 3 men filed out of the diner with considerably less swagger than they'd displayed on entry, leaving behind an atmosphere crackling with electricity and possibility. Sarah stood amid the scattered documents, her heart pounding with adrenaline and something that felt dangerously like hope. They'll be back, she said, though the prospect no longer terrified her the way it had 20 minutes earlier. Yes, Colonel Webb agreed, but next time you'll be ready for them. Sarah looked at him questioningly, and he gestured toward the brass key still clutched in her palm. It's time you understood what I meant about the rifle. Before she could respond, the diner's phone rang with the jarring electronic tone that always made her jump. She glanced at the clock. 4:17 a.m., far too early for any normal business call. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the receiver. Mickey's Diner. Sarah, thank God. The voice belonged to Elena Rodriguez, a regular customer whose husband worked night shifts at the nearby freight depot. I'm sorry to call so late, but I didn't know who else to reach out to. Carlos didn't come home from work tonight, and the depot says he never showed up for his shift. I'm scared something's happened. To him, Sarah's stomach clenched with familiar dread. Carlos Rodriguez was one of the steadiest men she knew, devoted to his wife. Reliable as sunrise, the kind of person who'd never simply disappear without explanation. If he was missing, something was seriously wrong. When did you last hear from him? Sarah asked, her mind already racing through possibilities. Yesterday evening, around 6. He was getting ready to leave for work, seemed fine, just tired like always. Elena's voice cracked with barely controlled panic. Sarah, He's been different lately, quieter, having nightmares, I think. I think he might be in trouble." Sarah looked at Colonel Webb, who'd been listening to her side of the conversation with growing concern. Their eyes met across the counter, and she saw her own understanding reflected in his gaze. Carlos Rodriguez wasn't just missing, he was another casualty of a system that broke people and then discarded them when they could no longer function. "Elena, I want you to stay exactly where you are," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I'm going to make some calls, see what I can find out. And Elena, you did the right thing by calling me." She hung up the phone and found Colonel Webb already reaching for his jacket, his expression grim with purpose. "How well do you know Carlos?" he asked. "Well enough to know that if he's missing, it's because something broke inside him that he couldn't fix alone." Sarah grabbed her own jacket from behind the counter, her movements quick and decisive. "He's former military, isn't he? Army, 2 tours in Iraq." Colonel Webb's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many Carlos Rodriguez's over the years. Elena mentioned nightmares, PTSD symptoms that he's been hiding, probably for months. Sarah thought about all the conversations she'd had with Carlos over the past year, the subtle signs she'd noticed but hadn't known how to interpret. The way he sometimes startled when the coffee machine hissed. The way he always sat facing the door, scanning the room like he was expecting threats. The way he'd grown thinner, more drawn, as if something was eating away at him from the inside. "We have to find him," she said, the words carrying more conviction than she'd felt about anything in years. Colonel Webb nodded grimly. "Before he makes a decision he can't take back." As they prepared to leave the diner in search of a broken veteran who'd lost his way in the darkness, Sarah felt the brass key warm against her palm. She was beginning to understand that some battles couldn't be fought with coffee and kind words. Some battles required different weapons entirely. The surveillance photos Blackwood had left behind fluttered in the air-conditioning breeze, a reminder that their enemies were organized, well-funded, and determined to shut down anything that threatened their version of order. But as Sarah looked at Colonel Webb's resolute expression and felt the weight of purpose settling into her bones, she realized that their enemies had made a crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that compassion was weakness, that kindness could be intimidated into silence. They were about to learn how wrong they were. 6 months later, the morning rush at Mickey's Community Center, as the diner had officially been renamed, carried a different energy than the desperate quiet Sarah remembered. From her early days serving coffee to insomniacs and broken souls, the counter buzzed with purposeful conversation as veterans shared job leads over breakfast. Elderly residents coordinated transportation to medical appointments, and former foster youth discussed their college plans with volunteer mentors who understood the weight of starting over. Sarah moved through the familiar routines with practiced efficiency, but her role had evolved far beyond serving coffee. She was coordinator, counselor, and strategic planner for a network that now spanned 3 counties, each location staffed by people who'd learned to recognize the hidden wounds that others carried. The brass key hung from a chain around her neck, now transformed from token to talisman, a reminder that the most powerful weapons were often the ones that looked like simple kindness. "How many applications came in this week?" asked Lisa Martinez, the former foster youth who'd become Sarah's deputy and heir apparent. At 22, Lisa possessed the same intuitive gift for seeing people that had made Sarah effective, combined with an organizational mind that could transform compassion into systems. 47, Sarah replied, reviewing the stack of requests from communities across the Southwest who wanted to establish their own centers. Phoenix, Flagstaff, and 2 small towns in New Mexico. Word is spreading faster than we can keep up. The Amanda Webb Foundation had exceeded even Colonel Webb's optimistic projections, drawing support from unexpected sources as people recognized the practical effectiveness of the community-centered approach. Veterans organizations provided Training and resources. Churches offered meeting spaces and volunteer networks. Even some government agencies had begun partnering with the centers, recognizing that prevention was more cost-effective than crisis intervention. But the real proof of success wasn't in the statistics or funding reports. It was in the faces of people who'd found their way back to hope. Carlos Rodriguez entered the diner in full dress uniform, his bearing straight and confident in a way that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. His wife Alina followed, carrying a folder, thick with documents and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just accomplished something significant. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, though Carlos's smile already provided the answer. "I'm officially the new Veterans Outreach Coordinator for San Bernardino County," he announced, his voice carrying pride tempered with humility. "Thanks to a recommendation from a certain Marine colonel who apparently carries some weight with the VA administration." Elena set down her folder and embraced Sarah with the warmth of someone expressing gratitude that couldn't be adequately put into words. "They're funding a mobile crisis intervention program based on what you've built here. Carlos will lead a team that responds to veteran suicides across the region." Sarah felt the familiar flutter of recognition, another life transformed from victim to healer, another broken soul who'd found purpose in their pain. The pattern had repeated itself dozens of times over the past months, each success creating ripples that extended far beyond what they could measure. "There's more," Carlos continued, his expression growing serious. "The program comes with authority to investigate systemic barriers to veteran services. Bureaucratic roadblocks, funding diversions, officials who prioritize politics over people's lives." His smile turned sharp with satisfaction. "Starting with a certain city planning commissioner who's been using his position to harass organizations that serve vulnerable populations. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." Sarah's pulse quickened with interest. Richard Blackwood had continued his campaign of intimidation even after the diner's transformation, apparently unable to accept that his brand of authoritarian control had been rendered obsolete by something as simple as effective community care. "What kind of authority?" she asked. "The kind that comes with federal backing and congressional oversight," Carlos replied. "Turns out that some senators have been asking uncomfortable questions about why veteran suicide rates remain so high in regions with adequate funding for services. When they started investigating, they found patterns of corruption and mismanagement that go all the way to Washington." Elena opened her folder and spread out a collection of documents that made Sarah's breath catch. FBI surveillance photos, financial records, recorded conversations, evidence of a network of officials who'd been systematically undermining services for veterans, homeless individuals, and immigrants in order to maintain political control and personal profit. "Blackwood wasn't working alone," Elena explained. "He was part of a larger operation that saw community organizations like yours as threats to their power structure. They couldn't allow the idea to spread that people could take care of each other without government oversight and control." Sarah studied the documents, noting how her small diner had become a focal point in a much larger battle over the nature of community and the source of security. The recognition was both humbling and terrifying to think that her simple acts of kindness had been perceived as revolutionary enough to warrant coordinated suppression. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we watch them try to explain their actions to federal investigators," Carlos replied with grim satisfaction. "And we continue building something better while they're distracted by trying to avoid prison." 2 years later, the conference room at the University of California, Riverside, buzzed with the kind of excited energy that accompanied paradigm shifts in academic thinking. Sarah sat at the front table, still uncomfortable with the formal setting, but recognizing the importance of what was happening. The symposium on community-centered intervention models had drawn researchers, policymakers, and practitioners from Across the country, all seeking to understand how a waitress in a roadside diner had developed an approach to social services that was proving more effective than decades of traditional programming. The key insight, Dr. Patricia Wong was explaining to the assembled audience, is that Ms. Chen's model inverts the traditional power structure of social services. Instead of requiring vulnerable individuals to navigate complex bureaucratic systems to receive help, the community creates conditions where help is embedded in daily social interactions. Sarah listened to the academic language being used to describe what had always felt natural to her, the simple recognition that people needed to be seen and valued before they could be effectively helped. The research data was impressive. Communities with centers based on the Mickey's model showed 60% reductions in suicide rates, 45% improvements in employment outcomes for veterans, and 70% decreases in recidivism among former foster youth. But what the statistics couldn't capture was the transformation she witnessed daily, the way people carried themselves differently when they knew they belonged somewhere, when they understood that their lives had meaning beyond their struggles. "Miss Chen," called a voice from the audience during the question period, "what advice would you give to communities that want to implement similar programs, but lack your particular background and skill set?" Sarah stood slowly, still adjusting to the idea that rooms full of educated professionals wanted to hear her thoughts on policy and implementation. "I think you're asking the wrong question," she said, her voice carrying the confidence that had grown through years of difficult practice. "You don't need my skill set. You need to develop your own version of it." She gestured toward the audience, noting the mix of social workers, academics, and community organizers who'd come seeking solutions. "Every person in this room has encountered someone who was struggling, someone who needed to be seen and heard and valued. The skill isn't exotic, it's the willingness to slow down enough to really pay attention, and the courage to act on what you see." Dr. Huang nodded approvingly. "But surely there are technical aspects to scaling this kind of intervention. The technique is relationship," Sarah interrupted gently. "Everything else is just logistics. You can teach people to recognize signs of trauma, to de-escalate crisis situations, to connect individuals with appropriate resources. But you can't teach someone to care about strangers unless they're already carrying that capacity inside themselves." The question session continued for another hour, but Sarah found her attention drifting toward the windows, where late afternoon sunlight painted the campus in golden tones that reminded her of desert mornings. She was scheduled to return to Barstow that evening, to the center that had become the flagship of a movement she'd never intended to start. But first, there was one more stop to make. That evening, Riverside National Cemetery spread across rolling hills east of the city, its white headstones arranged in precise rows that spoke of military order and eternal watch. Sarah walked the familiar path to Amanda Webb's grave, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers and a letter that had taken her weeks to write. Colonel Webb was already there, standing at attention beside his daughter's headstone. At 57, he looked younger than when she'd first met him. Purpose had replaced despair. Action had healed the wounds that retirement and loss had opened. His role as director of operations for the Amanda Webb Foundation kept him traveling constantly, but he still made this pilgrimage every month. "How did the symposium go?" he asked as Sarah joined him beside the grave. "Overwhelming," she replied honestly. "I still can't quite believe that something that started with serving coffee has become the subject of academic study." "Amanda would have loved it," Colonel Webb said softly, his voice carrying pride and lingering sorrow in equal measure. "She always believed that the best teaching happened through example rather than explanation." Sarah knelt and placed the sunflowers against the headstone, noting how the inscription captured the essence of the young woman she'd never met. Amanda Elizabeth Webb, beloved daughter, dedicated teacher, light in dark places. Below that, a more recent addition, her legacy lives in every life touched by love. "I have something for you," Sarah said, withdrawing the letter from her jacket pocket. From the kids at the newest center in Flagstaff. They wanted to thank Amanda for inspiring the program that saved their lives. Colonel Webb accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from emotion or age, Sarah couldn't tell. As he read the handwritten messages from teenagers who'd found hope in places modeled after Mickey's diner, his expression shifted through grief and pride and something that looked like peace. 27 centers now, he said when he finished reading. Over 300 trained staff members. Thousands of lives directly impacted. He looked at Sarah with eyes that held the clarity she'd first recognized across a diner counter. You've built an army, Sarah. An army of people who refuse to let others disappear into despair. Sarah thought about the rifle, still secured in Colonel Webb's truck, still waiting for the day when she might need its precision for protection, rather than just practice. She'd become proficient with the weapon over the past 2 years, understanding that some situations required the credible threat of force rather than the gentle application of compassion. But more often, she relied on weapons that looked like coffee pots and listening ears, on the revolutionary power of treating every person as if their life had meaning. What's next? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Expansion, Colonel Webb replied with the decisiveness that had made him an effective military commander. International pilot programs. Legislative advocacy for policy. Changes that support community-centered approaches. Training partnerships with major universities. He paused, his expression growing more serious. And preparation for the backlash that always comes when entrenched interests realize they're being made obsolete. Sarah nodded, understanding that their success had created new enemies, even as it had eliminated old ones. The corruption investigation that had brought down Blackwood and his network had revealed the scope of resistance to community empowerment. Models. There were powerful people who profited from systems that kept vulnerable populations dependent and desperate, and they wouldn't surrender that profit without a fight. Are you ready for that fight? Colonel Webb asked. Sarah touched the brass key around her neck, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with carrying other people's hope. I've been ready since the night you walked into my diner and reminded me that I was already armed with everything I needed. 5 years later, the graduation ceremony took place in the high school gymnasium in a small town outside Tucson, the same high school where Maria Santos had once been written off as just another foster kid with behavioral problems and no realistic prospects for success. Now 22, Maria stood at the podium wearing the cap and gown of someone completing her master's degree in social work, her thesis on community-centered intervention models already accepted for publication in a major academic journal. Sarah sat in the audience, watching the young woman she'd first met as a terrified 17-year-old runaway transform into a confident advocate for others who'd followed similar paths. Maria's journey from homeless youth to graduate student to center coordinator embodied the multiplication effect that had made the Mickey's model so powerful. 5 years ago, Maria was saying, her voice carrying to the back of the gymnasium, I walked into a diner in Barstow because I was hungry and desperate and had nowhere else to go. I expected judgment, charity, maybe a few hours of warmth before I had to return to the streets. She paused, her eyes finding Sarah in the crowd. Instead, I found someone who saw me. Really saw me. Not as a problem to be solved or a statistic to be managed, but as a person with potential that I couldn't see in myself. The audience, a mix of family members, educators, and community leaders, listened with the kind of attention that came when people recognized they were witnessing something significant. Maria's story had become legendary in social work circles, not because it was unique, but because it was so replicable. The Amanda Webb Foundation didn't just give me resources, Maria continued. It gave me a model for how to live in the world, how to see the hidden wounds that others carry, how to offer dignity instead of pity, how to transform pain into purpose. She gestured toward her graduating classmates. many of whom had similar stories of transformation. We're not just earning degrees tonight. We're joining an army of people who refuse to let others disappear into despair. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes as she recognized her own words reflected back through someone who'd internalized their meaning and made them her own. This was how change really happened, not through dramatic gestures or policy mandates, but through the patient work of one person teaching another to see clearly, to act with precision, to care with strategic effectiveness. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photographs and celebration, Maria approached Sarah with the easy confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate both trauma and triumph. "I have news," she said, her smile carrying excitement tempered with nervous energy. "The foundation approved my proposal. I'm opening a center in Guatemala, working with communities that serve families affected by migration and violence." Sarah felt the familiar flutter of recognition, another life transformed from victim to healer, another broken soul who'd found ways to use their pain as a tool for protecting others. "When do you leave?" "Next month." "And Sarah ... Maria paused, clearly struggling with how to express what she was feeling. "I want you to know that you saved my life. Not just that first night in the diner, but every day since, by showing me what it looks like to be human in a world that tries to make us forget our humanity." Sarah embraced the young woman who'd become a daughter in all the ways that mattered, feeling the weight of legacy settling into her bones. She was 31 years old now, no longer the desperate waitress who'd served coffee to broken souls while struggling to pay off her father's medical debt. She was a recognized expert in community intervention, a sought-after speaker, the architect of a movement that had touched thousands of lives across multiple continents. But more importantly, she was still the woman who could look at a stranger and see their hidden wounds, who could offer dignity instead of judgment, who could remind people of their worth when they'd forgotten it existed. 10 years later, the documentary crew had been following Sarah for 3 months, capturing both the daily operations of the original Mickey's Center and the global network it had spawned. The Waitress and the Colonel, a revolution disguised as breakfast, was scheduled to premiere at Sundance, with advanced screenings already generating the kind of attention that made Sarah uncomfortable but grateful. She stood outside the original diner, watching the sunrise paint the Mojave Desert in familiar shades of hope and possibility. At 36, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd learned to wield power responsibly, who understood that true leadership meant elevating others rather than dominating them. Colonel Webb's memorial service had been held. Here 6 months earlier, the diner transformed into a celebration of a life dedicated to service beyond self. His final letter to Sarah had contained the deed to his ranch, along with instructions for converting it into a training center for community intervention specialists. But more importantly, it had contained his final lesson, that immortality came not through avoiding death, but through ensuring that your work continued in the hands of those you'd taught to see clearly. "Ms. Chen?" The documentary producer approached with the careful respect that had become familiar over the years of media attention. "We're ready for the final interview." Sarah nodded, settling into the chair they'd positioned beside the diner's entrance. The questions would be the same ones she'd answered hundreds of times about the night Colonel Webb had walked into her life, about the moment she'd understood her gift, about the challenges of scaling compassion into systematic change. Today, she wanted to say something different, something that captured the fullness of what she'd learned over the decade, since a broken Marine had handed her a brass key and taught her to see herself clearly. "The most dangerous thing in the world," she said, looking directly into the camera, "isn't a weapon or a virus or a natural disaster. It's the belief that individual lives don't matter, that some people are disposable, that suffering is inevitable and help is impossible." She paused, letting the words settle. "The most powerful thing in the world is the recognition that every person you encounter is carrying wounds you can't see and possibilities they don't know they possess. The camera continued rolling as Sarah spoke about the hundreds of centers now operating worldwide, the thousands of staff members who'd learned to recognize and respond to hidden trauma, the millions of lives that had been touched by a model that treated compassion as a precision instrument rather than a vague aspiration. But what she didn't mention, what she'd never spoken about publicly, was the rifle that still traveled with her, secured in a custom case in her vehicle. She'd used it only twice in 10 years, both times to protect communities from threats that couldn't be addressed through kind words and coffee service. The weapon remained what Colonel Webb had always intended it to be, a tool of last resort, employed only when precision violence was required to protect something precious. Most people never needed to know that the woman who'd revolutionized social services by treating everyone with dignity was also capable of eliminating threats with deadly accuracy. But in a world where powerful interests still profited from human desperation, where corruption and cruelty still masqueraded as policy and order, it was important that some people knew. As the sun climbed higher over the desert, painting the sky in shades of infinite possibility, Sarah thought about her father, about Amanda Webb, about Colonel Webb, about all the people who'd sacrificed everything to ensure that others could live with dignity and hope. Their deaths had meaning because their lives had created ripples that extended far beyond what they could have imagined. And in a diner in Barstow, California, where broken souls still came to be seen and healed and equipped to carry that recognition back into the world, their legacy continued to unfold, one coffee cup, one conversation, one life at a time. The interviewer asked his final question, something about advice for young people who wanted to make a difference in the world, and Sarah smiled, thinking about the brass key that now hung around the neck of a former homeless veteran who was opening the newest center in Chicago. "Start small," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned that revolutions often began with the simple decision to treat strangers as if their lives mattered. Pay attention, see people clearly, and remember that the most powerful weapons often look like the simplest acts of kindness. As the camera stopped rolling and the crew began packing their equipment, Sarah returned to the familiar routines that had sustained her for over a decade: brewing coffee, preparing for the morning rush, creating space for broken souls to remember their worth. Outside, the desert stretched toward horizons that seemed infinite, holding the promise that somewhere beyond the visible landscape, other people were she was just a waitress, until the Marine colonel handed her his sniper rifle.